In the dim glow of Europe's early medieval dawn, history remembers the rise and fall of empires, the clash of armies, and the slow reconstruction of a world emerging from the ruins of Rome. Yet beneath this familiar tapestry lies a quieter thread, a shadowy lineage whispered about in chronicles, hinted at in myths, and kept alive in secret traditions. It is a story that seems too strange for conventional history, yet too persistent to dismiss. The tale of the Merovingians is one such thread, a dynasty that ruled parts of what is now France and Germany, but which carries with it a far deeper aura of mystery. Their legacy lingers in legends of sacred blood, hidden knowledge, and an influence that may have stretched far beyond the borders of Europe, perhaps even into the shaping of the New World itself. To enter this story is to step into a world where fact and folklore intertwine like strands of a single braid. The Merovingians have often been portrayed as more than kings, almost as mythical beings, said to possess healing powers, supernatural insight, and a divine right to rule. Chroniclers describe them as long-haired kings, as if their uncut hair itself held a sacred force. Their origins were attributed to a union between a queen and a sea creature, a legend preserved in medieval texts not because anyone believed it literally, but because such stories carried symbolic weight in a world where myth was a vessel for hidden truths. Who were these rulers, really? And why does their legacy seem to echo through the centuries in ways that feel larger than life? The Merovingians were not simply a dynasty. They were a symbol of a Europe still forming its identity, a Europe where ancient pagan traditions blended uneasily with the emerging power of the Christian Church. They existed in a space where old gods had not yet been forgotten, and new dogmas had not yet seized absolute control. It is no wonder, then, that stories of them shimmer with a mystical quality. Some scholars believe that the aura surrounding the Merovingians was deliberately cultivated. Others suggest it was enforced by forces trying to suppress a lineage that carried dangerous secrets. But regardless of the reason, the effect is undeniable. Whenever the Merovingians are mentioned, the tone of history itself seems to shift. This is what makes their story so compelling. Their dynasty collapsed more than 1,000 years ago, yet the fascination remains. Why? Perhaps because history is rarely as clean as textbooks present. There are gaps, unexplained events, sudden changes in power, lost manuscripts, vanished artifacts. And occasionally, there are lineages that seem to disappear only to resurface in the most unexpected places. The Merovingians are often associated with such mysteries. From esoteric societies in medieval Europe to coded references in Grail lore, their name appears again and again where secrecy and symbolism converge. It is within this atmosphere of half-hidden truths that a bolder possibility arises. What if the influence of Europe's earliest sacred royal family did not end with their downfall? What if the bloodline, the traditions, or the knowledge they guarded found new life through secret networks that survived in the shadows? Many theorists and historians, not always mainstream, but often deeply researched, suggest that the Merovingians may have passed their heritage into the hands of families, orders, or travelers who carried pieces of their legacy into later centuries. And as Europe moved toward the age of exploration, could these hidden forces have shaped decisions that led to the discovery and settlement of lands across the Atlantic? Consider how history often unfolds, not through grand public decisions, but through whispered alliances, private councils, and influences that never make it into official records. Europe's ruling families, explorers, financiers, and religious institutions were all intertwined in ways far more complex than school history allows. Behind them, even further out of sight, were the gatekeepers of ancient knowledge, monastic networks, knightly orders, mystical societies, all of which had their own dreams for the future. If the Merovingians left behind a legacy of sacred kingship, secret doctrine, or powerful symbolism, it is not impossible that shadows of this legacy traveled into the New World through those who inherited their cause. At this point, the line between history and mystery begins to blur, but not in a careless or fantastical way. Rather, it blurs in a way that invites curiosity. The New World was not merely discovered, it was envisioned. It was mapped in hidden manuscripts long before the world officially knew of its existence. It was sought by men who claimed to follow divine signs, ancient prophecies, or secret commissions. And it was shaped by colonial powers whose motives often reveal more beneath the surface. The possibility that the roots of these actions reach back to one of Europe's oldest royal bloodlines adds a new layer of intrigue to the story of the Americas. The purpose of this exploration is not to rewrite history, but to widen it, to linger in the dim corridors where recorded fact meets whispered tradition, and to consider how much of our past may be shaped by forces that rarely appear in textbooks. The Merovingians stand at the threshold of this mystery, a dynasty that seems ordinary at first glance, yet becomes stranger the closer one looks. Whether or not they directly shaped the destiny of the New World, their legacy forms a doorway through which we can explore the deeper, often overlooked currents of influence that flow beneath the surface of history. This is where our journey begins, not with certainty, but with possibility, with the quiet suspicion that some stories run deeper than we have been taught, and that some bloodlines carry echoes felt far beyond their own time and place. To understand the deeper mysteries surrounding this enigmatic dynasty, we must first step back into the world from which they emerged, a world shaped by crumbling empires, shifting tribes, and the slow reawakening of Europe after centuries of turmoil. The Merovingians did not appear in isolation. They rose from a landscape marked by both chaos and opportunity. As Rome's influence weakened in Gaul, new powers emerged, each trying to carve out territory, legitimacy, and identity. Among these rising groups were the Franks, a collection of Germanic tribes whose future would become intertwined with a land that would one day be called France. It was from within this loose confederation that the Merovingian line first took root, establishing a dynasty that would eventually rule for nearly 3 centuries. Their story begins in the 5th century with a figure known as Merovec, the semi-legendary founder from whom the dynasty takes its name. Merovec is a curious character in history, for much of what we know about him straddles the line between recorded fact and mythological embellishment. Medieval sources describe a strange origin tale. Merovec's mother, already pregnant, is said to have been visited by a sea creature or aquatic spirit known as the Quinator. Whether this fantastical account was meant to elevate Merovec's status, intimidate rivals, or conceal political narratives that would have been dangerous to express directly, we can only speculate. But the presence of such myth in the earliest description of the dynasty sets a tone, one where symbolism and story carry as much weight as genealogy and governance. As history moves out of legend and into firmer ground, the dynasty's influence becomes clearer. The Merovingians were not merely tribal chieftains. They were kings who ruled large territories, established legal traditions, and influenced the shaping of early medieval Europe. They presided over courts that blended Roman customs with Germanic laws, creating a hybrid culture that would form the foundation of Western Europe centuries later. Their capital at places such as Tournai and later Paris represented centers of emerging political power, where alliances were forged, marriages arranged, and territories consolidated. Yet their leadership was not defined solely by administrative skill or military might. Medieval chroniclers consistently emphasized the almost mystical aura surrounding Merovingian rulers. Their long hair, for example, was not simply a fashion or tradition. It was considered a sacred symbol of their right to rule. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was thought to strip him of his legitimacy, almost like removing a divine seal. Whether this belief originated within the dynasty or was projected upon them by others is unclear, but its effect is unmistakable. The Merovingians were perceived not just as kings, but as bearers of special status, almost priestly in nature. This fusion of political authority and sacred symbolism gave the dynasty an unusual place in history. Their kings were often described as having healing abilities, prophetic insight, or a mysterious connection to the spiritual world. These descriptions were not isolated exaggerations, but recurring motifs found in multiple sources. Such traits contributed to the image of a bloodline set apart, imbued with something beyond ordinary ancestry. And in a medieval world where divine favor was central to legitimacy, such qualities mattered greatly. Their rule also coincided with the spread of Christianity across the region, adding another layer to the dynasty's identity. Some Merovingian kings adopted the new faith eagerly, while others maintained older pagan traditions. This duality placed them at a crossroads between two spiritual worlds. As Christianity grew in institutional power, it sought to distance itself from older traditions. Yet the Merovingians stood with one foot in each realm, carrying echoes of forgotten rituals while navigating the demands of the church. This tension would shape their reputation for centuries, giving rise to theories that they guarded ancient knowledge or represented a lineage disliked by powerful religious authorities. Despite their mystique, the Merovingians were not immune to the political challenges that plagued early medieval Europe. Their kings often relied heavily on advisors, nobles, and mayors of the palace, figures who, over time, gained increasing control over the realm. This gradual shift of power allows historians to point to practical explanations for the dynasty's eventual decline. Yet even here, the way events unfolded invites deeper contemplation. The transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule was not a simple political shift. It was accompanied by narrative shaping, demonization, and the rewriting of history by those who benefited from change. The victorious Carolingians, ancestors of Charlemagne, had every incentive to present their predecessors as weak, decadent, or unfit to rule. It is from this narrative that the term Rois Faineants, or do-nothing kings, emerges, a label that may reflect propaganda more than reality. When we look beyond the surface-level accounts, the Merovingians appear far more complex than the dismissive descriptions would suggest. They were foundational rulers of early France, stabilizers of turbulent regions, and leaders whose influence extended across generations. They minted coins bearing their likeness, established monasteries, and helped define the cultural and religious landscape of Europe. They were by no means passive figureheads. But this is where the mystery deepens. If they were so influential, why does so much of their legacy feel obscured or forgotten? Why do their stories lean toward myth and enigma rather than clear, documented history? And why, unlike other dynasties, do they appear again and again in esoteric writings, Grail legends, and secret traditions? Perhaps the greatest intrigue surrounding the Merovingians is not their rule itself, but the lingering sense that their dynasty carried something unusual, a symbolic power, a hidden truth, or a lineage that some wish to preserve and others wish to erase. Their story, like a half-buried relic, invites us to brush away layers of dust and ask whether this forgotten bloodline may have influenced far more than conventional history acknowledges. And as we peel back those layers, we begin to see how their legacy might connect not only to medieval Europe, but to events and explorations that shaped the wider world beyond. The Merovingian dynasty's allure does not lie solely in its political achievements, but in the tangled web of myths and legends that surround it. As with many ancient lineages, separating fact from fiction is a delicate task. Their story is a mosaic of historical record, oral tradition, and esoteric speculation. What emerges is a narrative in which bloodlines carry more than inheritance. They carry symbolism, divine significance, and sometimes hints of supernatural power. Over centuries, the Merovingians became more than kings. They became archetypes of sacred rulership. Their long hair, mysterious origins, and supposed abilities forming the threads of a tapestry that fascinated chroniclers and conspiracy theorists alike. One of the most striking features of Merovingian lore is the emphasis on their bloodline as inherently sacred. Unlike ordinary dynasties, whose legitimacy often stemmed from conquest, marriage, or political maneuvering, the Merovingians were described as chosen, set apart by virtue of their lineage. This notion of divine blood became central to how they were perceived, and it was reinforced by both legend and practical politics. In a time when the right to rule was intertwined with spiritual favor, claiming descent from a sacred source provided an almost unassailable authority. Their ancestry, it was said, traced not merely to mortal rulers, but to mystical or even divine figures, a claim that imbued their reign with an otherworldly resonance. One persistent legend speaks of the Quinator, the sea creature that allegedly fathered Merovec. While the story may appear fantastical, its symbolic weight cannot be underestimated. In mythic terms, the union of human and otherworldly being represents the crossing of worlds, mortal and divine, natural and supernatural. By presenting Merovec as the product of such a union, chroniclers suggested that his descendants were not simply political leaders, but bearers of hidden power. This symbolic framing was echoed in later tales of Merovingian kings' abilities. Accounts tell of rulers who could heal with the touch of their hands, foresee events, or maintain order in times of chaos. Even if these stories are metaphorical exaggerations, they establish a theme. The Merovingians were considered exceptional, different, and potentially dangerous to those who wished to consolidate control. The notion of sacred kingship also played out in the dynasty's distinctive physical marker, the long hair of the Merovingian rulers. Unlike other monarchs, whose appearances were incidental to their authority, the hair of a Merovingian king was a direct symbol of his legitimacy. To cut, it was to strip him of power, to render him mortal in a sense that went beyond physical appearance. Some historians suggest that this could be interpreted as a vestige of older pagan beliefs, where the body itself carried spiritual significance. But the consistency of the motif across centuries and sources is striking. Long hair became a visual shorthand for divine favor, reinforcing the idea that the Merovingians were set apart in both blood and body. The intertwining of mythology, ritual, and genealogy created fertile ground for speculation about the dynasty's secret knowledge. Some scholars propose that the Merovingians were custodians of esoteric traditions, preserving teachings from pre-Christian Europe that had otherwise been suppressed. Others suggest that they held manuscripts or relics considered dangerous by the church or rival factions. Over time, this gave rise to the idea that the Merovingians were not just rulers of land, but keepers of hidden truths that could influence religion, politics, and even the trajectory of civilizations. In this way, their mythos transcends ordinary historical interest, touching on the archetypal notion of a lineage charged with special knowledge and responsibility. Yet, the mystique surrounding the Merovingians was not universally admired. Their sacred image may have contributed to fear, suspicion, or hostility. As the Carolingians rose to power, labeling their predecessors as weak or decadent became a useful tool. The do-nothing kings narrative minimized the achievements of the Merovingians, portraying them as passive, indulgent, and irrelevant. In reality, the contrast could not have been greater. The Merovingians ruled expansive territories, conducted military campaigns, and exercised complex administrative control. The disparity between legend and propaganda illustrates a broader point. Myths can be weaponized, reshaped to serve political ends, and yet the kernel of mystery often survives in spite of such manipulation. The enduring fascination with the Merovingians can also be traced through their associations with the Holy Grail. Grail legends, often framed as purely symbolic or literary, may have a historical dimension rooted in the sacred kingship of this dynasty. Some theorists suggest that the Grail was not a physical chalice, but a metaphor for the Merovingian bloodline itself, a line imbued with divine favor, mystical knowledge, and the potential to shape destiny. This interpretation blurs the line between legend and history, proposing that what has often been dismissed as myth may carry encoded references to real-world influence. The Grail, in this sense, becomes a cipher for understanding the hidden power and continuing fascination of the Merovingians. Artifacts, architecture, and even early medieval art provide further clues. Symbols associated with the Merovingians appear in churches, manuscripts, and heraldry, sometimes in subtle forms that are easy to overlook. Crosses, geometric motifs, and representations of long-haired figures hint at a visual language meant to convey authority, sanctity, or secret teachings. Whether these symbols were widely understood or intended for a select few, they contribute to a sense that the Merovingians operated in a dual reality, one public, one hidden, each reinforcing the other in ways that conventional history struggles to capture. Ultimately, the blend of myth, legend, and historical fact gives the Merovingians a unique place in European consciousness. They are more than kings. They are archetypes of hidden power, a dynasty whose story resonates with themes of divine selection, secret knowledge, and enduring influence. Each layer of legend, from Equinator to the Grail associations, from long hair to supposed healing abilities, reinforces the sense that the Merovingians were extraordinary, and that their legacy may have persisted long after the political power of the dynasty waned. The fascination endures because their story invites us to question what we take for granted in history. How much of what is recorded is shaped by those who wrote it? How much is lost, deliberately erased, or hidden in symbolic form? By exploring the myths and legends surrounding the Merovingians, we open a window into a world where bloodlines are not just biological, but spiritual, where rulers may have held secrets that extended far beyond their visible dominion, and where the echoes of an ancient dynasty might still be felt, quietly shaping narratives that stretch into the distant reaches of time and geography. Among the most persistent threads weaving through Merovingian lore is the connection to the Holy Grail, a symbol whose meaning shifts depending on who tells the story. For centuries, the Grail has been imagined as a sacred cup, a vessel of divine power, or a treasure guarded by knights. Yet in the context of the Merovingians, some researchers suggest a radically different interpretation. The Grail may not have been a physical object at all. Instead, it may have been a symbol for the dynasty itself, a lineage infused with sacred blood, mystical knowledge, and hidden authority. This perspective transforms our understanding of the Merovingians, suggesting that their significance may have been less about the lands they ruled and more about the heritage they preserved, a heritage capable of shaping the spiritual and political destiny of Europe, and perhaps even beyond. The connection between the Merovingians and Grail mythology is complex and multi-layered. Medieval texts such as Chrétien de Troyes, Perceval, and later continuations emphasize an elusive treasure, one accessible only to the worthy. Within these narratives, there is a recurring theme. The Grail is not simply found through force or conquest, but through recognition of lineage, virtue, and hidden knowledge. For those who theorize a Merovingian connection, this pattern is striking. If the bloodline itself was regarded as sacred, the Grail becomes less a chalice and more a code, a way to recognize and protect a lineage that carries unique spiritual authority. It is a lens through which to view European history, not as a sequence of random events, but as a continuum subtly influenced by families and dynasties that carried symbolic power. Some accounts suggest that the Merovingian bloodline was considered Christ-like, a term that evokes both reverence and secrecy. In these stories, the sacred nature of their ancestry was a carefully guarded truth, one that could not be openly proclaimed without risking political and religious backlash. The Church, growing increasingly powerful, often clashed with those who preserved older, esoteric traditions, seeing them as heretical or threatening. It is within this tension between public authority and hidden influence that the legends of the Grail and Merovingian lineage converge. The dynasty's secret may have been precisely the knowledge of how to balance these two realms, spiritual significance and worldly power. Evidence for this perspective is scattered but compelling. Some historians point to the elaborate symbolism in Merovingian-era art, coinage, and monuments. Crosses, geometric shapes, and stylized figures are repeated motifs, suggesting an encoded language of authority and divine favor. The long hair of the kings, for example, may have symbolized more than royal status. It may have been a visible sign of a sacred inheritance, a living emblem of the Grail-like lineage. Similarly, patterns in church architecture or preserved relics hint at ceremonial knowledge that was once centralized in the hands of this dynasty. These visual cues, though subtle, reinforce the notion that the Merovingians were not ordinary rulers, but custodians of a deeper spiritual tradition. The idea of a bloodline as Grail also aligns with later esoteric and mystical movements. Writers in the 19th and 20th centuries, including those exploring Rosicrucian, Templar, or Cathar traditions, frequently point back to the Merovingians as a source of hidden wisdom. According to these theories, the dynasty's descendants may have preserved secrets about governance, sacred geometry, alchemy, or divine symbolism, passing them down in coded forms to trusted initiates. Whether or not these claims are historically verifiable, they highlight a perception that the Merovingians were custodians of a legacy that extended far beyond conventional rule, a legacy encoded in both story and symbol. The Grail connection also raises questions about the broader influence of this lineage. If the Merovingians were linked to a sacred bloodline or esoteric knowledge, their fall from political power may have been less absolute than it appears. While the Carolingians replaced them as rulers, the Merovingians' spiritual and symbolic authority may have survived in hidden forms. This continuity could explain recurring patterns in European history: secretive alliances, mysterious patronage networks, and unexplained influences over monarchs and explorers alike. It suggests a world in which power is not only wielded openly through armies and treaties, but also subtly through recognition of hidden legitimacy, a legitimacy encoded in blood and ritual rather than law. Furthermore, the idea of the Grail as a symbol of lineage reframes many medieval conflicts. Wars, succession crises, and even church politics could be interpreted not merely as struggles over territory, but as contests over control of sacred knowledge. Those who claimed authority may have been vying to suppress, appropriate, or protect a bloodline deemed inherently potent. The Merovingians' mysterious aura, then, was not simply fanciful storytelling, but a reflection of real dynamics, a dynasty whose existence represented both a threat and an opportunity to other powers, spiritual and secular alike. This perspective also illuminates a curious paradox. The more the Merovingians were politically eclipsed, the more their mystique grew. Chroniclers often disparaged them as ineffective or decadent, yet legends of sacred kingship, divine blood, and the Grail persisted, sometimes more vividly than the historical record. This persistence suggests that the dynasty's true significance may have been hidden from ordinary view. It also points to the possibility that their influence did not vanish with their fall from power, but continued quietly, like a river flowing beneath the surface, shaping events in ways that would only become apparent centuries later. In contemplating the Grail and the Merovingians, we are invited to consider history not as a straightforward ledger of rulers and battles, but as a complex interplay of myth, symbolism, and hidden authority. The dynasty's sacred bloodline may have served as a kind of guiding principle, a touchstone of legitimacy that extended into realms both political and spiritual. Whether in the design of a cathedral, the succession of kings, or the preservation of secret knowledge, the echoes of the Merovingians hint at a world in which the visible is only part of the story, and the invisible, often overlooked, may be far more consequential. Ultimately, the Grail and the Merovingian lineage are intertwined in ways that resist simple explanation. They represent a story in which symbols carry power, bloodlines carry meaning, and secrecy can shape the course of history. As we continue to explore the dynasty, it becomes clear that to understand the Merovingians is to enter a world where the ordinary rules of history blend with legend, where kings may be more than they appear, and where the legacy of a sacred bloodline may extend far beyond the limits of time and geography. The Grail, in this sense, is not merely an object of myth, but a lens through which we begin to perceive the hidden architecture of European history, a thread connecting the past to mysteries that may reach even into the New World. As the Merovingians maintained their grip on parts of early medieval Europe, their reign was accompanied by a less visible, but perhaps more consequential form of power, the preservation and control of hidden knowledge. In an era when literacy was rare, when manuscripts were precious and painstakingly copied by hand, the accumulation of knowledge was not merely academic. It was a tool of influence, a means to shape events beyond the battlefield. There are tantalizing hints that the Merovingians understood this, and that they strategically positioned themselves as guardians of traditions, practices, and texts that might otherwise have been lost, or deliberately concealed by those who feared their implications. What kind of knowledge might have been at stake? Some evidence points to religious manuscripts, perhaps containing early interpretations of Christian texts that diverged from official church doctrine. Others suggest works of philosophy, science, or occult practice preserved from the Roman Empire or even earlier civilizations. Europe at this time was a patchwork of cultural memory, where pagan traditions survived alongside the Christianizing influence of monasteries and clergy. The Merovingians, by virtue of their dynastic position and sacred aura, may have had privileged access to these resources, giving them a subtle but extraordinary advantage over rivals. Control of knowledge was, in essence, control of the narrative of history itself. Consider the role of monasteries, which are the primary repositories of manuscripts in early medieval Europe. Many were founded or patronized by Merovingian rulers, suggesting a deliberate effort to curate intellectual and spiritual resources. Monastic libraries could contain everything from medical texts and astronomical charts to theological debates and ritual instructions. While most of these documents would have seemed mundane to outsiders, they represented a concentration of insight that few could challenge. Furthermore, some of these manuscripts were likely coded or esoteric in nature, accessible only to those trained in their meaning. In this way, the Merovingians may have functioned as a kind of shadow network of knowledge, a dynasty whose power was reinforced not only by armies, but by intellectual authority hidden from the casual observer. Cryptic symbolism was another form of preserved knowledge. From coinage to architecture, the Merovingians embedded motifs and designs that carried messages beyond mere decoration. Geometric patterns, symbolic animals, and repeated motifs can be interpreted as a visual language meant to communicate allegiance, identity, or spiritual alignment. While we cannot know the full scope of what these symbols meant, their consistency suggests intentionality. The dynasty was aware that the public could see the outward display of power, but only the initiated could understand the subtle codes woven into their cultural artifacts. This dual-layered communication, public and hidden, mirrors the approach of later secret societies, hinting at continuity between medieval dynasties and esoteric traditions that followed. The secrecy surrounding Merovingian knowledge was also political. In a world where rivals constantly vied for power, revealing too much could be dangerous. The Carolingians, for instance, did not simply replace the Merovingians because of military advantage. The narrative crafted after the transition often painted the previous kings as ineffective or decadent. If the Merovingians were indeed custodians of hidden knowledge, then suppressing or discrediting their legacy would have served a dual purpose: consolidating power for the new rulers and erasing potential threats that arose from secrets the Merovingians controlled. This makes the political downfall of the dynasty more than a mere transfer of territory. It may have been part of a larger effort to control information and influence that extended beyond what appears in traditional chronicles. Maps and early cartography also offer subtle hints of hidden knowledge. While exploration is often associated with the later age of discovery, there are surviving medieval maps that contain anomalies, depictions of distant lands, or advanced geographic concepts that suggest familiarity with areas supposedly unknown to Europe at the time. Some theorists propose that the Merovingians, with access to obscure texts, navigational knowledge, or private records from Roman times, may have played a role in preserving and transmitting this information. Whether these maps were used for exploration, trade, or ritual purposes, they represent a continuity of insight that aligns with the idea of the dynasty as a custodian of hidden truths. Religious and ritual practices also fall within the scope of their preserved knowledge. While the Merovingians adopted Christianity, there is evidence that pre-Christian traditions persisted, perhaps encoded in ceremonies, coronation rites, or even architecture. The king's supposed healing abilities, prophetic gifts, and connection to sacred bloodlines could be seen as part of a broader esoteric system, one designed to reinforce authority through spiritual as well as temporal means. To the average observer, these acts might have seemed miraculous or symbolic. To the initiated, they were the outward manifestation of knowledge and ritual carefully preserved over generations. The notion of suppression is equally significant. The very scarcity of direct evidence concerning certain aspects of Merovingian culture suggests deliberate concealment. Manuscripts disappear, artifacts vanish, and chroniclers either ignore or obscure details. Some of these losses may be accidental, but patterns emerge that hint at intentional erasure. Hidden knowledge, once considered dangerous or politically sensitive, often survives only in fragments, oral traditions, or encoded forms. This creates an enduring tension in our understanding. We have traces of the Merovingians' intellectual and spiritual power, but these traces are tantalizingly incomplete, leaving ample space for speculation, interpretation, and mystery. By positioning themselves as custodians of hidden knowledge, the Merovingians may have influenced more than their immediate territories. Their ideas, symbols, and rituals could have traveled quietly across Europe, absorbed into monastic networks, noble families, or secret societies that survive beyond the dynasty's political lifespan. This raises profound questions about the transmission of influence. Could the seeds planted by a dynasty now considered fallen have shaped the intellectual, spiritual, or exploratory currents of later centuries? Could early European expansion, exploration, and the subtle shaping of global history have been informed in part by insights preserved in Merovingian circles? Ultimately, the Merovingians' role as preservers of hidden knowledge reveals a different dimension of power, one that complements and sometimes surpasses conventional military or political authority. It is a form of influence that moves quietly, almost invisibly, shaping events through the control of information, symbols, and spiritual guidance. When we consider their legacy in this light, the dynasty's significance expands beyond the visible reign of kings to include a quieter, enduring presence that persists in the undercurrents of European history. Their story challenges us to reconsider how knowledge, secrecy, and lineage can shape civilizations, not only in the lands they ruled, but in the worlds that would emerge long after their supposed decline. The decline of the Merovingian dynasty did not happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, a combination of internal weakness, external pressure, and, some theorists argue, deliberate subversion. From the height of their power in the 6th and 7th centuries, the Merovingians gradually lost authority to a new class of administrators known as the mayors of the palace. These officials, originally stewards and managers of the royal household, began to accumulate political and military power, often overshadowing the kings themselves. Over time, the kings became figureheads, their authority reduced to ceremonial functions, their influence curtailed by those who controlled the levers of governance. Medieval chroniclers would later brand these rulers Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings, but the story behind this label is far more nuanced than simple laziness or incompetence. The political weakening of the Merovingians coincided with the rise of the Carolingians, a powerful noble family whose ambition and strategic acumen allowed them to position themselves as the true power behind the throne. The most famous of these, Charles Martel, exemplified the shift from symbolic kingship to realpolitik. Under the Carolingians, authority became increasingly centralized, military campaigns decisive, and the narrative of legitimacy carefully constructed. In this light, the so-called decline of the Merovingians appears less a natural consequence of dynastic failure and more a calculated replacement orchestrated by those seeking to consolidate power. Some historians suggest that the Merovingians were deliberately marginalized because their symbolic authority, sacred bloodline, and potential access to hidden knowledge represented a threat to the new order. The labeling of Merovingian kings as ineffectual served multiple purposes. On the surface, it justified the Carolingian takeover by portraying the transition as a corrective measure, a necessary restoration of order after decades of misrule. Beneath the surface, however, it functioned as a means of erasing the memory of a lineage that carried extraordinary symbolic and esoteric weight. If the Merovingians were custodians of sacred knowledge, guardians of hidden truths, or bearers of a bloodline considered divine or Christ-like, then their survival in political memory could inspire opposition or reverence among the population. By rewriting the narrative, the Carolingians not only claimed legitimacy, but also obscured the secrets and authority that the Merovingians had once wielded. The dynasty's fall was not only political, but cultural. As Carolingian influence spread, historical records were rewritten or reinterpreted. Monasteries and scribes, often under the direction of the new ruling class, emphasized Carolingian triumphs while minimizing Merovingian achievements. Chronicles depicted the earlier kings as indulgent, distracted, or spiritually weak, despite evidence of their administrative, military, and cultural accomplishments. This systematic denigration created a veil of forgetfulness, a historical amnesia that continues to influence our perception of the Merovingians today. For a dynasty with a purportedly sacred bloodline, the consequences were profound. Their public authority disappeared, but their mystique, paradoxically, deepened. Yet disappearance from power did not necessarily equate to disappearance from influence. There are compelling arguments that the Merovingians' legacy continued in more subtle forms, hidden from official records but preserved in secret networks, rituals, and perhaps even through descendants who survived under new names or alliances. The idea that the bloodline persisted in secret aligns with contemporary theories of esoteric history, suggesting that dynasties rarely vanish entirely. Instead, they adapt, hiding in the shadows, transferring knowledge through trusted channels, and influencing events behind the scenes. The Merovingians, with their combination of sacred blood, symbolic authority, and hidden knowledge, would have been well-positioned to continue shaping the world in ways invisible to chroniclers loyal to the Carolingians. The tension between visibility and secrecy also emerges in ceremonial traditions. Even as political power waned, elements of Merovingian ritual persisted. Coronation rites, sacred symbolism, and religious practices often retained echoes of the older dynasty, even under Carolingian rule. These remnants suggest that while the dynasty was politically eclipsed, its spiritual and symbolic authority lingered. Such persistence is subtle, almost invisible, yet leaves traces in architecture, manuscripts, and ritual practices, evidence that the influence of a bloodline considered sacred cannot be entirely erased by conquest or propaganda. The nature of the Merovingians' fall invites speculation about the forces at play behind the historical record. Were they simply victims of weak kingship, or was their decline engineered by rivals who feared their symbolic and spiritual power? Some researchers argue that the rapid consolidation of power by the Carolingians, combined with the systematic denigration of their predecessors, points to a deliberate effort to suppress a lineage whose significance extended beyond the visible realm of politics. If true, this would frame the transition not as a simple change of dynasty, but as a strategic erasure of a bloodline whose legacy could have challenged the authority of the new rulers. Moreover, the fall of the Merovingians opens questions about the fate of their hidden knowledge. If the dynasty controlled esoteric texts, sacred relics, or maps of lost or distant lands, the transfer or concealment of these resources would have been critical. Those who survived the political upheaval may have taken measures to preserve the most dangerous elements of their legacy, passing them into monasteries, secret societies, or even private collections. In this way, the decline of the Merovingians from the historical record does not necessarily mean the decline of their influence. It may have simply shifted to channels less visible to contemporary historians. The story of the Merovingians' decline is, therefore, more than a tale of political failure. It is a narrative of power, secrecy, and survival, where a dynasty's public disappearance masks the persistence of hidden authority. Their fall illustrates the complex interplay between visible power and symbolic influence, showing how history is often shaped as much by erasure and concealment as by conquest. It also underscores the enduring fascination with the Merovingians, a dynasty whose political power may have ended, but whose legacy, in blood, knowledge, and myth, continues to intrigue, to inspire, and to provoke questions about the unseen forces that have shaped Europe and, perhaps, the wider world. Even as the Merovingians were eclipsed politically, there are whispers that their story did not end with the rise of the Carolingians. Historians and esoteric scholars alike have long speculated that descendants of the dynasty survived, quietly preserving their heritage in secrecy. These survivors, operating in the shadows, may have passed on knowledge, wealth, and symbolic authority, ensuring that the influence of the Merovingians endured long after the last official king was dethroned. The idea of hidden bloodlines is not unique to the Merovingians, but their combination of sacred lineage, spiritual aura, and historical significance makes the possibility particularly compelling. The survival of Merovingian descendants is thought to have taken multiple forms. Some may have been absorbed into other noble families through marriage, their lineage concealed yet perpetuated in the aristocratic networks of Europe. Others may have joined religious institutions, where they could safeguard manuscripts, relics, and ritual practices without drawing attention. Secret societies, whether Proto-Templar, Rosicrucian, or otherwise, could have provided a framework for protecting and transmitting knowledge to selected initiates. In all cases, the emphasis seems to have been on discretion. The legacy was to be preserved, not flaunted. This careful stewardship allowed the dynasty's essence to endure, even when political power had vanished. Oral traditions played a critical role in maintaining the memory of the Merovingian bloodline. Legends, coded stories, and symbolic practices could be passed down quietly, generation to generation, without leaving overt traces in the historical record. In an era when literacy was limited and political suppression was common, oral transmission was not only practical but essential for survival. Tales of sacred kingship, healing powers, and divine ancestry persisted in this hidden form, ensuring that the Merovingians' identity and significance were never entirely lost. These narratives, embedded in folklore, ritual, and the very culture of regions they once ruled, formed a subtle but enduring network of memory and influence. The potential reach of surviving Merovingians extended beyond Europe. Some theories suggest that descendants, or at least those carrying fragments of their knowledge, may have participated in ventures that shaped the early exploration and colonization of the New World. If the dynasty's influence included secret maps, knowledge of navigation, or understanding of occult principles tied to power and destiny, it is conceivable that these survivors played a quiet role in guiding explorers, settlers, and political figures. While direct evidence is scarce, the patterns of secrecy, continuity, and symbolic authority suggest a lineage adept at operating in hidden spheres of influence, even across continents. The question of secrecy also intersects with a broader European fascination with hidden knowledge. The Merovingians were often associated with mystical practices, sacred relics, and esoteric symbolism. If these associations were more than legend, they would have provided an additional incentive to conceal descendants and their activities. Bloodlines carrying sacred or mystical significance are rarely left unprotected. The combination of spiritual authority and political threat makes discretion paramount. For centuries, families claiming or believed to carry Merovingian heritage may have acted as custodians of traditions that mainstream history sought to suppress or ignore. The idea of a surviving bloodline also aligns with legends of hidden wealth. Tales of Merovingian treasure, whether physical riches, sacred relics, or coded manuscripts, have circulated for centuries. While much of this is speculative, the possibility that descendants carried with them resources that could confer power, influence, or knowledge is consistent with patterns seen in other displaced dynasties. Treasure, after all, is not merely material. It is often symbolic, representing continuity, legitimacy, and a link to a sacred past. The Merovingians' supposed hoards, like their lineage itself, may have been carefully concealed, passed from generation to generation under the cover of anonymity. Political survival required strategic alliances. Marriages, patronage networks, and covert partnerships would have provided the means for Merovingian descendants to maintain influence without attracting attention. This careful navigation of social and political landscapes mirrors the methods of other secretive or displaced families throughout history. By embedding themselves within the structures of emerging power while preserving core knowledge and heritage, these descendants could shape events indirectly, exert influence quietly, and ensure that the dynasty's significance was never entirely erased. Religious institutions offered another sanctuary. Monasteries, convents, and cathedral chapters could serve as repositories for manuscripts, sacred objects, and esoteric knowledge. Descendants working within these institutions could act as both custodians and transmitters, ensuring continuity while remaining under the radar of secular authorities. The combination of spiritual legitimacy and hidden authority created a protective shield, allowing the Merovingians' essence to persist even as overt political power had disappeared. Here, the line between myth and reality blurs, leaving only traces for later historians and modern theorists to interpret. The persistence of Merovingian influence in secret networks also resonates with patterns seen in later European history. Secret societies, knightly orders, and esoteric movements often claim or imply connections to ancient bloodlines and hidden knowledge. While direct evidence linking these groups to Merovingian descendants is largely circumstantial, the similarities are striking. Emphasis on secrecy, coded transmission of knowledge, and reverence for sacred lineage. Whether these groups were consciously preserving Merovingian heritage or simply operating within a cultural memory of sacred bloodlines, the connection underscores the possibility of a quiet, enduring influence that operates beyond the visible framework of history. Ultimately, the story of surviving Merovingians is a story of adaptation, discretion, and continuity. The dynasty's political collapse did not necessarily signal the end of its influence. Instead, it may have marked a transformation, shifting from the open exercise of kingship to a hidden guardianship of knowledge, symbols, and sacred lineage. This survival in the shadows explains much about why the Merovingians continue to fascinate modern scholars, esoteric enthusiasts, and storytellers. They embody the enduring mystery of power that is not always visible, a force that can persist across centuries, continents, and hidden networks. In contemplating these hidden descendants, we are invited to reconsider the meaning of historical survival. Power is not solely measured in armies or titles. It can also exist in symbols, rituals, manuscripts, and quiet influence. The Merovingians, through careful preservation of their heritage, may have ensured that their presence echoed far beyond their apparent fall. Their story challenges us to look beyond surface history, to consider the hidden currents that shape civilizations, and to entertain the possibility that sacred bloodlines, secret knowledge, and enduring traditions can continue to guide events even when the world believes they are gone. In this quiet persistence lies the true enigma of the Merovingians, a dynasty that refuses to disappear entirely, leaving traces in shadow, story, and secret. By the late 15th century, Europe was on the cusp of transformation. The medieval world, long defined by fragmented kingdoms, tribal loyalties, and the slow expansion of centralized power, was giving way to a new era of exploration, trade, and global ambition. In this period of transition, the continent was restless, intellectually, spiritually, and politically. Advances in navigation, printing, and cartography were expanding the horizon of human knowledge, while emerging nation-states competed fiercely for wealth, influence, and religious authority. It is in this turbulent landscape that the question arises: could the remnants of older dynasties, such as the Merovingians, still exert influence behind the scenes, subtly guiding events that would shape the New World? Europe on the eve of discovery was a continent obsessed with maps and secrets. Monarchs were keenly aware that knowledge of distant lands could confer unimaginable power, yet much of this knowledge was jealously guarded. Private collections, secret manuscripts, and coded charts were often accessible only to trusted advisors, scholars, or hidden networks of influence. In such a climate, a lineage with a history of preserving sacred and esoteric knowledge, like the Merovingians, could have wielded remarkable influence, even centuries after losing formal political authority. Their descendants, operating quietly through alliances or religious institutions, may have been perfectly positioned to guide explorers and shape the ambitions of European courts. The political landscape of Europe was shifting rapidly. Spain, Portugal, England, and France were all vying for control of new trade routes, mineral wealth, and colonial territories. This competition created a sense of urgency and secrecy. Expeditions were planned with care, often funded privately or by ambitious monarchs eager to outmaneuver rivals. Navigation was not merely a technical skill, it was a closely guarded art. Knowledge of wind patterns, currents, and distant lands could determine the fate of kingdoms. If the Merovingians, or those preserving fragments of their legacy, had access to hidden charts or pre-existing knowledge of lands across the Atlantic, they may have influenced these early voyages, subtly steering Europe toward the Americas before history officially recognized the discovery. Religious motives also played a crucial role. The Catholic Church, in the wake of reform and centralization, sought to exert influence over new territories and conversions. At the same time, older spiritual traditions persisted in secrecy, some perhaps preserved by those with ties to ancient bloodlines. The Merovingians' association with sacred kingship, mystical practices, and hidden knowledge may have provided them with a spiritual framework to guide the selection of explorers, the timing of expeditions, or even the symbolic rituals associated with claiming new lands. In a world where spiritual authority and temporal power were intertwined, such influence could have been subtle yet profound, shaping not just maps, but the moral and cultural narratives imposed upon the New World. Economic and social pressures further intensified the drive for exploration. Europe was experiencing population growth, urbanization, and shifts in trade networks that demanded new resources and markets. Monarchs and financiers alike understood that control of overseas territories could secure wealth and consolidate influence. The notion that secret lineages like the Merovingians might have subtly guided these developments adds a layer of intrigue. Their knowledge of hidden networks, sacred traditions, and long-term strategy could have been a quiet force behind the rush to explore, colonize, and dominate lands that were still largely unknown to the European mind. Science, too, was undergoing transformation. Advances in astronomy, navigation, and mathematics made long-sea voyages feasible. Yet much of this knowledge remained restricted, disseminated only through trusted channels. Hidden dynasties, with centuries of accumulated wisdom, may have been invaluable in this context. Whether in advising rulers, influencing cartographers, or passing down encoded information about currents and coastlines, the potential role of Merovingian survivors becomes more plausible when we consider the practical value of their knowledge. Europe's push westward may not have been purely opportunistic. It could have been guided subtly by those with foresight, experience, and access to long-preserved secrets. The intrigue deepens when considering the interplay between public and hidden authority. While monarchs were the visible agents of exploration, they were surrounded by advisors, financiers, and intellectuals whose loyalties and influences often went unrecorded. Secret networks, including those possibly connected to Merovingian descendants, could have shaped decisions behind closed doors, influencing which expeditions were launched, which territories were targeted, and which alliances were forged. The layers of authority in late medieval Europe allowed for subtle interventions that, while invisible to the general populace, could have had lasting consequences. This period also saw the convergence of legend and ambition. The mythos surrounding sacred bloodlines, hidden knowledge, and divine guidance was not mere fantasy. It informed the mindset of rulers, explorers, and their patrons. Belief in destiny, providence, and mystical authority provided justification for expansion and conquest. Within this context, the Merovingians' lingering symbolic presence may have offered more than nostalgia. It could have served as a framework for understanding and legitimizing bold, unprecedented actions. Their hidden influence, encoded in tradition, ritual, and secret guidance, may have shaped the motivations and decisions of those charged with exploring unknown worlds. In short, Europe on the eve of discovery was a continent poised for transformation, driven by ambition, knowledge, and spiritual narrative. The convergence of these factors created conditions in which hidden dynasties could exert influence disproportionate to their visible power. The Merovingians, with their legacy of sacred blood, preserved knowledge, and symbolic authority, fit seamlessly into this picture. Their influence, though invisible to most, may have guided exploration, informed political strategy, and helped determine the trajectory of history that led to the New World. By the time Columbus, Cabot, and Vespucci set sail, the stage may already have been prepared by centuries of hidden currents shaped by a dynasty long thought to be extinct. Thus, the eve of the Age of Discovery is not merely a story of European ambition, technology, or courage. It is also a story of hidden influences, of lineages that survived in shadow, and of knowledge carefully preserved and deployed at the moment of opportunity. The Merovingians, though officially vanished, may have quietly contributed to shaping the ambitions of nations, guiding explorers across oceans, and leaving their mark on the very beginning of the New World. In this context, history is revealed not only in the documents we can read, but in the invisible hands that shaped events, steering continents, empires, and destinies along paths that remain partly obscured, yet profoundly consequential. Throughout medieval Europe, symbols moved silently through the centuries, etched into stone, carved into royal seals, woven into banners, and hidden in the geometry of sacred buildings. These symbols were not random ornaments. They were messages, memory devices, declarations of royal legitimacy, and in some cases, whispers of forgotten bloodlines. When exploring the Merovingian world, these hidden emblems become clues, breadcrumbs leading through the darkness of time and into places far beyond France. Some researchers have argued that these symbols did not remain confined to Europe. They may have traveled across oceans, resurfacing unexpectedly in the early iconography of the New World. To understand such claims, we begin by examining the symbols themselves. The Merovingians were obsessed with the bee, a creature that, to ancient minds, represented immortality, resurrection, and the divine right of kingship. Archaeologists uncovered 300 golden bees buried with the supposed tomb of Childeric I, their delicate wings still intact after more than a millennium. These bees predated the fleur-de-lis, another symbol associated with French royalty, and may have been the original emblem of Merovingian authority. The bee is unusual as a royal sigil. Insects rarely appear in European heraldry. Yet here it served not as a mere decoration, but as a sacred identifier. Some esoteric traditions suggest that these bees symbolized a secret continuity of power, a lineage sustained through initiation rather than force. Another symbol often tied to Merovingian lore is the fish. This connection is partly etymological, with some theories linking the name Merovec to Mare Sea, but it also arises from a mystical legend of the Quinator, the sea creature that supposedly fathered the dynasty. The idea of a divine or semi-divine origin was not unique to the Merovingians, but the imagery surrounding it became deeply embedded in their regalia and mythology. The fish motif also has resonance in Christian symbology, especially during the early centuries of the faith. Though the mainstream view is that these parallels are coincidental, mystery traditions often merge them, suggesting layers of meaning designed to appear innocent on the surface while communicating hidden truths. The fleur-de-lis is perhaps the most recognized symbol associated with France, but its origins remain debated. Some believe it evolved from a stylized bee, others from water lilies along the Lys River. In Merovingian contexts, the fleur-de-lis was used sparingly, yet later dynasties adopted it as a sign of continuity with the ancient kings. Whether or not such continuity existed historically, the symbol's proliferation helped cement the idea of an unbroken royal thread. Esoteric researchers argue that the fleur-de-lis encoded sacred geometry, triads, trinities, and the union of heaven and earth. Gothic cathedrals, such as Chartres and Notre Dame, incorporated the shape subtly into their stone tracery, as though marking the sacred places where royal and spiritual authority converged. Gothic cathedrals themselves are among the most enigmatic structures of medieval Europe. Their floor plans align with astronomical patterns. Their stained glass windows form mandalas of color and light, and their facades are layered with symbols drawn from older pagan traditions. According to some interpretations, these buildings served as repositories of forgotten knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, and metaphysical. The architects, often connected with monastic orders or later with proto-Masonic guilds, left designs that could be read like books of stone. If the Merovingians had indeed preserved occult traditions, these structures may have been places where such wisdom was quietly honored long after their political power faded. One striking detail is the recurring use of geometric alignments, triangles, vesica piscis patterns, and rose windows constructed with ratios that appear in sacred architecture worldwide. While mainstream historians attribute this to the spread of mathematical knowledge, conspiracy theorists argue that these patterns reveal initiation-based societies working behind the scenes. The Merovingians, as a semi-mythic origin point of European sacred kingship traditions, become entangled in this web of connections. What is especially intriguing is how several of these symbols reappear unexpectedly in early American iconography. The fleur-de-lis appears in multiple colonial coats of arms, especially in territories influenced by France, but also in odd places. Early maps drawn by English and Dutch explorers, unofficial seals, and proposed designs for cities that would not be built for centuries. Sometimes it appears alongside symbols such as the compass, the eye, or the five-pointed star, marks commonly associated with Freemasonry. Though the fleur-de-lis in America is usually attributed to French influence, the sheer frequency of its use, even beyond French contexts, raises questions about whether deeper symbolic traditions were traveling across the Atlantic. The bee also appears in early American symbolism. In some cases, it represents industry or unity, as in the famous beehive imagery used by early American Masonic lodges. However, a few researchers argue that the use of bees in Masonic symbolism may trace back to the same esoteric traditions that venerated them in Merovingian Gaul. The beehive is a symbol of order, community, and sacred labor, concepts that resonate with both monastic and Masonic ideals. Though no historian has claimed a direct link to the Merovingians, the symbolic echo is nonetheless striking. Even more curious are the geometric layouts of certain colonial cities. Washington, D.C., designed largely by Pierre Charles L'Enfant, includes multiple alignments and shapes that researchers have connected with European esoteric design principles. While these patterns are most frequently associated with Freemasonry, it is worth noting that the Masonic tradition draws upon older strands of symbolism, including those tied to early medieval kingship. It is possible, though far from proven, that these symbolic lineages continue subtly through architecture, influencing the way power is expressed in physical spaces. Maps from the Age of Exploration contain their own mysteries. Several Dieppe maps, created in France during the 16th century, depict strange land masses, mythical beasts, and symbols that seem out of place for practical navigation. Among these are fleur-de-lis markers placed not only on known French territories, but also on speculative or unknown lands. Some historians argue that this simply reflected French cartographic tradition. Others propose that the mapmakers were encoding political aspirations, claims to future territories, or even allegories of ancient royal legacies. In tracing these symbols across continents and centuries, one encounters an enigmatic pattern. Motifs that began in the courts of early French kings end up woven into the spiritual, political, and architectural frameworks of a new world that did not exist when the Merovingians ruled. Whether this is coincidence, cultural diffusion, or a sign of deeper esoteric continuity remains unresolved. But the recurrence of these symbols invites speculation that history may hold more hidden connections than the official records admit. As Europe approached the twilight of the Middle Ages, the world was changing with a quiet intensity. Empires were rising and collapsing, knowledge was being rediscovered, and maps were being redrawn by hands that sensed the horizon was no longer an edge but an invitation. The Age of Exploration did not arrive suddenly. It emerged from centuries of rivalry, ambition, and the subtle pressure of dynasties hungry for influence. Within this turbulent atmosphere, the question arises, were certain royal families driven by motives far older than their official charter suggested, motives perhaps rooted in forgotten bloodlines like the Merovingians? In the decades before voyages crossed the Atlantic, Europe resembled a chessboard dominated by a few powerful houses. The Valois and Bourbons in France, the Habsburgs across Austria and Spain, the Tudors in England, the Avis dynasty in Portugal. All were locked in an elaborate struggle for dominance. But beneath this surface-level contest lay a deeper undercurrent, shaped by alliances, marriages, and whispered genealogies. Royal identity in this era was not merely political, it was metaphysical. Kings ruled by divine right, or claimed to, and establishing lineage was as vital as raising armies. Among these lineages were families who traced, or quietly suggested they traced, their ancestry back to the earliest royal houses of Europe. Some French noble families, particularly those in regions historically associated with the Merovingians, held traditions asserting ancient descent. Whether fact or embellishment, these claims influenced perceptions of legitimacy. And legitimacy mattered when navigating the rough waters of European geopolitics. A king backed by ancient lineage could negotiate with more authority, command loyalty with fewer words, and justify territorial ambition with a simple genealogy. It is in this context that the New World began entering royal imagination. For some monarchs, overseas expansion promised wealth, territory, and exotic goods. For others, it represented a chance to establish a new dominion free from the fractious politics of the Old World. But for certain circles, especially within France, there existed a more mystical allure. The idea of founding a new kingdom across the sea, one that could revive or continue ancient traditions suppressed in Europe, appealed to secretive groups, missionary orders, and visionaries who believed the future of Christendom might unfold far from its birthplace. Explorers and navigators, though often portrayed as rugged adventurers, rarely operated independently. They served kings, financiers, and religious orders. Christopher Columbus worked under Spanish authority, but his motivations were colored by older prophecies and whispered connections to esoteric traditions. Portuguese caravels sailed under royal patronage that was heavily intertwined with the Knights of Christ, an order some believed carried remnants of Templar knowledge. French expeditions were backed by noble patrons whose ambitions went beyond mere geographical curiosity. Each voyage was a fusion of political calculation and private ideology. France, in particular, had a unique position in this emerging age. While Spain and Portugal raced ahead with early voyages, France moved more cautiously, yet with deeper symbolic intent. French kings and courtiers participated in a grand ideological vision, the idea that France held a special destiny connected to ancient kingship. Even after the Merovingians vanished from the official historical stage, their legend lingered in monasteries, noble households, and secretive brotherhoods. Some claimed that France was not merely a kingdom. It was a continuation of a sacred lineage stretching far back into mythic time. When French explorers looked west, they saw more than land. They saw possibility, a blank slate for shaping identity, a chance to establish communities aligned with ideals that could not survive the crowded courts of Europe. Colonization often carries the image of economic enterprise, but in the French imagination, it frequently carried overtones of spiritual or philosophical mission. Missions to convert local populations coexisted with subtler missions to transplant culture, ritual, and symbolic identity. England and Spain viewed the New World as a resource. France often viewed it as a canvas. In the salons of Paris and the monasteries of Burgundy, intellectuals and clerics debated whether unknown lands might hold descendants of the lost tribes, traces of ancient wisdom, or places where prophecy would unfold. While historians today dismiss such ideas as fringe, they undeniably influence the mindset of the age. The Old World was burdened by wars, plagues, and theological conflict. The New World seemed untouched, a perfect stage for the rebirth of something older. Dynastic marriages also played a role in shaping exploration. As royal families intermarried, genealogies merged. A noble house with distant claims to ancient blood could expand its influence by aligning with maritime powers, ensuring that distant voyages also carried their symbolic heritage. Through these marriages, French and Breton families with Merovingian claims gained connections to explorers, financiers, and court advisors. Some of the most ambitious voyages included participants whose backgrounds were quietly tied to such lineages. As maps grew more accurate, royal rivalries intensified. Control of coastlines and rivers meant control of future trade routes. But control of narratives, how history would remember these expeditions, was equally important. Monarchs wanted their reigns associated with discovery, enlightenment, and divine favor. Establishing a foothold in the New World allowed kings to shape history, not merely inherit it. Religious orders added another layer of complexity. Jesuits, Franciscans, and later Huguenots journeyed across the ocean, each with its own set of beliefs and symbolic traditions. Many of these orders were steeped in esoteric interpretations of scripture, prophecy, and ancient kingship. Some believed that spreading their influence westward was part of a grand cosmic purpose. Though mainstream historians view these ideas with skepticism, records from the era include letters, journals, and sermons filled with language about destiny, divine calling, and the unfolding of a long-awaited plan. By the time the first European settlements took root in the Americas, the world that sent them forth was a mosaic of competing visions. Behind every expedition lay layers of royal ambition, ideological fervor, symbolic meaning, and whispered connections to ancient bloodlines. The Age of Exploration was not simply a movement of ships across water. It was a movement of ideas, old ideas, seeking new soil. Whether or not the Merovingians directly influenced these voyages remains open to interpretation. But the environment into which the New World was discovered was shaped by dynasties obsessed with legitimate lineage, by nobles who claimed descent from mythic kings, and by secretive groups that believed ancient authority could be resurrected across the Atlantic. In this sense, the shadow of Europe's earliest royal houses stretched far beyond their vanished kingdoms, reaching all the way to the shores of lands they never knew existed. Long before ships crossed the open Atlantic with confidence, the shape of lands unseen appeared mysteriously on parchment. The history of exploration is supposed to be linear. First, the old world speculates, then it discovers, then it maps. But scattered throughout archives in Europe are maps that disrupt this simple progression. Charts filled with astonishing detail centuries before proper surveys, land masses drawn with uncanny accuracy, and coastlines sketched as though by men who had walked them long before any documented voyage. These are the puzzles that keep historians awake at night. They also fuel deeper speculation. Who were the map makers? Where did their knowledge come from? And why do some of their symbols suggest connections to secret traditions and ancient lineages? The Age of Exploration is often depicted as a triumph of navigators, but it was equally a triumph, perhaps even a mystery, of cartographers. The most famous enigma among them is the Piri Reis map of 1513, a work created by an Ottoman admiral who claimed to be based on older charts no one has been able to identify. The map includes fragments of the Americas at a level of accuracy far ahead of its time. Even more perplexing, some researchers argue that the outline of the Southern Territories suggests knowledge of regions that were supposedly unknown until centuries later. While mainstream scholars attribute this to artistic interpretation or copying errors, alternative theories propose the existence of forgotten sources, maps drawn by earlier civilizations, or secret voyages erased from the official timeline. Not far behind in mystery are the Dieppe maps, created by French cartographers in the 16th century. These maps depict strange continents labeled with exotic names, land masses that appear to mix myth and reality, and coastlines that, once laid against modern charts, reveal surprising similarities. But what makes the Dieppe maps especially intriguing is that many were commissioned by French nobility deeply involved in esoteric and political networks. Their maps include fleur-de-lis markers placed far beyond territories France could realistically claim at the time. Historians usually dismiss these symbols as decorative or aspirational, yet the consistency of their placement raises other possibilities. Some researchers believe these mapmakers may have been drawing from information circulating in secretive circles, groups that preserved ancient knowledge outside of official institutions. Medieval Europe was a world where scholars, monks, navigators, and nobles often shared information quietly, outside the eyes of the church or state. Hidden manuscripts passed through monasteries, travelers whispered stories in coded language, and families with ancient lineages protected genealogies and documents others could not access. It is within this hidden intellectual economy that the earliest hints of the New World may have circulated long before Columbus set sail. The idea that European royalty, particularly those with ties to ancient dynasties, might have guarded older knowledge is not entirely implausible. Royal libraries often contained works unavailable to common scholars. Noble families intermarried with sailors, merchants, and scholars, creating channels through which information flowed in unconventional ways. If any family believed it descended from ancient kings or carried a mandate tied to sacred geography, it might have collected maps not just as tools but as relics, symbolic keys to lands that fulfilled prophecy or lineage. The mapmakers themselves were not merely artisans. They were interpreters of secret worlds. Their charts combined empirical observation with inherited lore. Many belonged to guilds or brotherhoods that valued geometry, astronomy, and ancient mathematical principles. The tools they used, compass, astrolabe, quadrant, were physical instruments, but the symbols they drew were often metaphysical. Some maps embed geometric ratios linked to sacred architecture. Others align coastlines along perfectly measured arcs of latitude, long before such precision was officially possible. Among the strangest details is that certain early maps portray the coastlines of the Americas in ways that seem more accurate than maps drawn 100 years later. One explanation is that early explorers charted them thoroughly, but the data was lost or hidden. Another, more speculative view suggests that mapmakers worked from ancient source maps predating medieval Europe. These hypothetical originals might have originated from civilizations with advanced knowledge of navigation, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, or even cultures lost entirely. If such maps were rare, guarded, or passed through select hands, it would explain why only a few cartographers reproduced fragments of them. There is also the question of symbolic markings, strange icons placed near coastlines, islands represented with exaggerated grandeur, stars, or geometric shapes positioned in seemingly empty spaces. Some of these symbols resemble those found in medieval esoteric manuscripts. Others echo motifs associated with royal bloodlines, particularly those thought to preserve fragments of Merovingian heritage. While mainstream scholars view these symbols as artistic filler, alternative researchers argue they are markers of knowledge, perhaps indicating rumored safe harbors, sacred sites, or regions where ancient myths placed forgotten lands. Royal patronage played a central role in the creation of such maps. Kings and nobles funded cartographers to produce works not only for navigation, but also as status symbols and instruments of diplomacy. A beautifully decorated map symbolized power and intelligence, projecting an image of a monarch who understood the world better than his rivals. Yet some maps appear to have been produced for more private reasons, lacking elaborate decoration, but filled with coded information. Several of these maps were never displayed publicly, surviving only in estate archives or monastic collections. It is within this obscured world that the question arises: did certain families, possibly those linked to ancient royal traditions, guide or influence early geographical knowledge? If a lineage believed it carried a hidden mandate, it might have sought lands where that mandate could be fulfilled. The New World offered such a possibility, a blank page on which to write an old story. Mapmakers aligned with these families would have been encouraged to collect, synthesize, or preserve geographical information unavailable to the general public. By the time widely recognized voyages began, a peculiar situation had emerged. Explorers sailed into waters that some maps seemed to have anticipated. Cartographers drew coastlines that explorers later verified. And certain royal courts appeared unusually confident about lands they had supposedly never seen. Whether this reflects coincidence, lost sources, or the influence of secretive networks remains unresolved. But the mapmakers of the early modern world left behind more than charts. They left clues. Symbols, alignments, names, and proportions that hint at a deeper, more complex story beneath the surface of official history. A story in which ancient traditions, long-hidden knowledge, and powerful families may have quietly shaped the way the world was drawn, long before it was ever reached by ship. When French sails finally appeared on the horizon of the New World, they carried with them more than explorers, soldiers, and missionaries. They carried ideas, old ideas, wrapped in the ambitions of a nation that had long imagined itself the heir to ancient kings. France entered the race for the Americas later than Spain or Portugal, yet the French presence in the New World possessed a strangely symbolic, almost spiritual tone. It was as though the voyages were not simply expeditions, but the continuation of a mission whispered about in courts, monasteries, and secretive salons back in Europe. To understand this dimension, one must look closely at the motives that shaped French colonial ventures and the quiet undercurrents guiding the men who crossed the Atlantic. France, unlike the more commercially driven maritime powers, often approached exploration with a sense of destiny. The idea of New France was not merely geographic. It carried a mythic aura that attracted visionaries, dreamers, religious reformers, and noble families who believed they had a spiritual or historical calling. Some were influenced by prophecies that spoke of a future kingdom across the sea. Others were guided by esoteric beliefs, suggesting that the New World was a place where lost traditions could take root. In the background of these beliefs lingered older ideas connected to France's own ancient bloodlines, particularly the memory of the Merovingians. Though no official documents declare such motives, the private writings of explorers and patrons often reveal hints. Metaphors about renewal, symbolic references to sacred kingship, and curious remarks about lands destined to receive the light of old France. When reading these fragments, it becomes difficult to dismiss the idea that certain expeditions may have carried purposes beyond trade and territory. The first French attempts at colonization were failures, yet they set the stage for a pattern that would repeat across the next century. Small groups, driven by a combination of royal ambition and spiritual purpose, struggling to build footholds in a vast, unfamiliar continent. One of the earliest examples is the ill-fated attempt at establishing a colony in Brazil under Nicolas Durand de Villagagnin. The official purpose was strategic, but Villagagnin himself was a figure steeped in religious complexity. Some described him as a mystic, others as a reformer, and still others as a man torn between conflicting doctrines. His colony attracted not only soldiers and craftsmen, but also Huguenots, French Protestants who carried with them a sense of mission, persecution, and prophetic destiny. Though the colony failed, its existence hinted at deeper motives within French exploration, the search for a place where forbidden ideas could be practiced freely. In North America, similar patterns emerged. Jacques Cartier's voyages in the early 16th century were sponsored by King Francis I, a monarch fascinated by symbolism, prophecy, and the legacy of ancient kingship. Cartier's journals occasionally mention omens and cryptic references to destiny. He described the lands he discovered with the language of possibility, not merely resources, but potential foundations for something enduring. While most historians interpret these comments as poetic enthusiasm, some believe that the court of Francis I, with its alchemists, astrologers, and secretive scholars, viewed the New World through a mystical lens. As French exploration grew more structured, figures like Samuel de Champlain entered the stage. Champlain was a complex character, part soldier, part idealist, part diplomat. Though he wrote with practical clarity, he was supported by networks of patrons whose interests went beyond trade. Among these were noble families with rumored ties to ancient dynasties, men who believed that France possessed a sacred identity. Some belonged to secretive societies or had connections to monks who guarded old genealogies. The support they gave to New World ventures suggests that these expeditions held symbolic value for them. One particularly intriguing aspect of French colonization is the presence of religious orders with esoteric or semi-esoteric traditions. The Jesuits, for example, were deeply intellectual, fascinated by mathematics, astronomy, and cultural syncretism. Their missions in the New World were driven by zeal, but also by curiosity about indigenous traditions. Their letters describe the New World in terms that sometimes resemble mystical pilgrimage more than missionary work. They built settlements that served as laboratories for social and theological experimentation. Their fascination with local languages, myths, and cosmologies suggests that they were searching for something, perhaps traces of lost tribes, echoes of old wisdom, or parallels with European esoteric teachings. Another layer of intrigue emerges when examining small, less documented expeditions financed by nobles during the 17th century. Some of these voyages included individuals carrying sealed letters of introduction, mysterious chests whose contents were never described, or genealogical manuscripts meant to be delivered to colonial leaders. Though mundane explanations exist, the secrecy surrounding these objects invites speculation. A few colonists recorded rumors that certain French families hoped to establish a new principality across the sea, one free from the constraints of European politics. If such ambitions existed, they may have been connected to old legends about restoring ancient kingship, perhaps even reviving symbols associated with the Merovingian myth. Fortresses and settlements established by the French often included elements of symbolic design. Patterns resembling sacred geometry appeared in their layouts, though this may reflect the influence of military engineering. Still, some historians have noted curious symbols carved into early structures, crosses, fleurs-de-lis arranged in unusual patterns, and occasionally the enigmatic mark of the beehive, a symbol long tied to French esoteric traditions. These details could be coincidence, or they could reflect the quiet presence of individuals who carried symbolic traditions into the New World. French explorers also displayed a strange sensitivity to place names. They often chose names that invoked saints, celestial phenomena, or royal symbols. Territory was not simply mapped, it was consecrated. This practice reinforced the idea that these lands were being woven into the cultural and spiritual fabric of France, not merely claimed. By the late 1600s, France's presence in the New World stretched from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi. The vast domain of La Louisiana held enormous symbolic weight. It was named after King Louis XIV, a monarch whose court was obsessed with ritual, mythology, and the idea of divine kingship. Some French thinkers of the era described North America as a new domain for the old spirit of France, a land where ancient traditions might flourish without interference. Whether these ideas were merely poetic or reflected deeper ambitions remains uncertain. But when one steps back and examines the pattern, mystics among early settlers, nobles with obscure genealogical interests, religious orders with esoteric leanings, symbols encoded in architecture and maps. The French presence in the New World begins to look less like simple colonization and more like the unfolding of a quiet, symbolic mission. A mission that some believe carried the faint echo of a forgotten royal legacy, traveling across the ocean in the hands of those who believe the New World was not just a discovery, but a destiny. Across the vast expanse of the early American colonies, genealogy was more than a record-keeping habit. It was a quiet form of identity, a declaration of belonging, and, in some cases, a shield for secrets. In a world where new settlements rose from forests and rivers, families carried with them names that hinted at ancient origins, whispered lineages, and old European loyalties. Among these were claims, legends, and subtle connections that would, over generations, weave a faint but persistent thread between the New World and some of the oldest royal bloodlines of Europe. And at the center of many of these whispered genealogies stood the enigmatic shadow of the Merovingians. The idea that Merovingian blood may have found its way to the Americas is not part of any official historical narrative, yet it lingers in the margins, in personal letters, local legends, Masonic archives, and the genealogical records of families whose origins seem to reach back far beyond the colonial era. Some of these families arrived quietly, without the fanfare associated with noble migration. They purchased land, married into established households, and built new identities in frontier settlements. Yet when tracing their ancestry, researchers sometimes encounter strange gaps, abrupt shifts in naming patterns, or references to European relatives who cannot be easily identified in public archives. One of the most intriguing patterns appears among French and Scottish settlers who came to North America during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Many of these families came from regions in France historically connected to Merovingian lore, areas like Burgundy, Champagne, and the Languedoc. Others arrived from Scotland, where several noble houses maintained traditions claiming descent from early Frankish kings. These claims were rarely displayed openly. Instead, they survive in discreet genealogical manuscripts, handed down through private family lines, copied into the margins of Bibles, or preserved through oral tradition. The frontier environment of North America provided a strange opportunity for reinvention. Families who might have lived under the scrutiny of European courts now had space to shape their own narratives. Some built modest lives. Others rose rapidly through alliances, land grants, and strategic marriages. As these families integrated into colonial society, their Old World origins slowly blended with their new identities, leaving behind only faint markers of their European past. One such marker appears in marriage patterns. In certain regions, especially in French Canada, Louisiana, and parts of New England, specific families intermarried repeatedly across generations. On the surface, this seems like simple proximity or cultural cohesion. But closer examination reveals something else. These intermarrying families often shared European surnames with deep historical roots. Some had connections to noble houses known for guarding genealogical records. Others came from areas in Europe where traditions about ancient bloodlines persisted long after they disappeared from official history. These familial networks became even more complicated when linked to the rise of Freemasonry in the colonies. Masonic lodges emerged early in American history, often founded by individuals who arrived with European initiations. Some of these lodges included symbols, rituals, and hierarchies with echoes of older traditions connected to sacred kingship, ancient geometry, and the preservation of royal bloodlines. In rare cases, colonial lodge records refer to members with unusual titles, references to hereditary brethren, or custodians of ancient lineage. Though historians interpret these phrases symbolically, esoteric researchers argue that they indicate the presence of individuals whose ancestry carried special significance. Louisiana, with its deep French roots, holds some of the most intriguing genealogical puzzles. Many early settlers came from noble or semi-noble families displaced by wars or political upheaval in Europe. Some brought documents that were never fully cataloged, including sealed letters, family crests, and genealogical scrolls. A few colonial priests wrote about parishioners who carried ancient names or possessed an unusual knowledge of European heraldry. In local folklore, stories circulate about families said to descend from old kings, though the sources of these stories are often buried under centuries of retelling. In Canada, particularly in Quebec, several families maintained strong ties to France's aristocratic circles. Their parish records include references to distant relatives in noble households, including some known to have claimed descent from early French dynasties. These connections were not flaunted, they were guarded. In some cases, the families blended into the fabric of colonial society, their noble origins dissolving under the demands of survival. Yet their descendants preserved subtle echoes. Unique coats of arms painted on wood, relics carried across the ocean, or traditions passed down through generations. Perhaps the most enigmatic connections appear in the Appalachian regions, where Scottish and French settlers merged into new communities. As the colonies transformed into a nation, a subtle architecture of power began to take shape, an architecture that seemed to draw from sources older than the Enlightenment philosophies publicly celebrated by the Founding Fathers. Beneath the surface of political debates, commercial expansion, and territorial ambition, a quieter network pulsed with symbols, rituals, and ideas that felt strangely ancient. These networks, while publicly described as fraternal or philosophical, carried deeper echoes that some researchers link to the old dynastic traditions of Europe, and specifically to myths surrounding the Merovingian bloodline. In the new American Republic, a curious paradox emerged. The nation was founded on the rejection of monarchy, yet many of its most influential figures were steeped in traditions that venerated ancient kingship, sacred lineage, and hidden knowledge. This contradiction becomes more intriguing when exploring the proliferation of secret societies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Lodges, circles, fraternities, and esoteric orders began appearing in major cities and frontier settlements alike. They attracted merchants, judges, generals, surveyors, and statesmen, individuals shaping the nation's political and cultural identity. And within their rituals, signs, and teachings, certain motifs appeared with surprising consistency. One symbol that repeatedly surfaced was the bee, an ancient emblem long associated with the Merovingians, representing leadership, resurrection, and divine right. While historians often dismiss such appearances as metaphorical or aesthetic, the recurrence of this symbol in early American lodges raises questions. Why would a symbol tied so strongly to pre-Carolingian France emerge in groups whose members claimed inspiration from medieval stonemasons or classical philosophy? Some argue the bee was simply a universal sign of industry and order. Others believe it reveals a deeper continuity, a preservation of symbols connected to lineages far older than the American experiment itself. Another recurring motif was the fleur-de-lis. In the New World, it appeared in coats of arms, lodge decorations, and even in the early architecture of public buildings. Though commonly associated with French heritage, the fleur-de-lis also carries ancient connotations linked to sacred kingship and, according to certain esoteric traditions, the bloodline believed to descend from the earliest Frankish rulers. Its presence in early American symbolism, especially in contexts unrelated to French colonial influence, adds yet another piece to a puzzle that mainstream history rarely addresses. Several of the founding fathers were themselves deeply involved in esoteric societies. This involvement is well documented, yet the specific teachings they encountered remain less clear. Some lodges followed standard fraternal rituals. Others, however, were connected to European traditions with roots in Renaissance Hermeticism, Templar mythology, and ancient concepts of divine kingship. Within these more obscure branches, stories of sacred bloodlines were not merely symbolic. They were treated as historical truths, guarded behind layers of allegory and initiation. The influence of these esoteric traditions began to intertwine with the emerging American identity. Maps, city plans, and public ceremonies occasionally bore marks of geometric symbolism reminiscent of Old World sacred architecture. Washington, D.C., designed with precision and geometric intention, has been interpreted by some researchers as a landscape encoded with ancient meanings. While interpretations vary wildly, some grounded in scholarship, others drifting into speculation, the consistent presence of symbolic geometry suggests that the builders of the new capital imagined themselves participating not only in political nation-building, but in the continuation of a tradition far older. It is within this context that whispers of Merovingian influence arise. The Merovingian kings, remembered for their long hair, sacred aura, and mysterious association with spiritual authority, represented a concept of rulership that blended the political with the mystical. Unlike later monarchs who relied on bureaucratic legitimacy, the Merovingians were said to rule by virtue of something innate, something tied to blood, destiny, or divine origin. Although this concept seems at odds with the ideals of the American Republic, echoes of sacred leadership appear persistently in the language of early nationalists. They spoke of destiny, providence, chosen people, and a nation guided by a higher purpose. These weren't merely political slogans. They carried theological and esoteric undertones. As America expanded westward, certain families, some tracing their roots to colonial elites, others claiming ancestry from French or Scottish nobility, moved into positions of increasing influence. They established towns, universities, banks, and trading companies. Their networks stretched across generations, forming a quiet backbone of the nation's social and economic landscape. Many of these families, though outwardly secular, held ancestral legends linking them to old European houses. In the quiet corridors of certain museums, libraries, and private archives scattered across North America, objects rest behind glass or in sealed drawers, fragments of history that seem, at first glance, unremarkable. Wooden boxes etched with geometric carvings. Old family Bibles with extra pages slipped between a binding. Wax seals bearing designs that do not appear in any standard heraldic registry. Worn rings engraved with symbols whose meaning has faded from collective memory. Each of these objects carries a story, but some whisper a story older and stranger than the nation that now preserves them. For those who search the hidden intersections between European dynastic lore and the formation of the New World, such artifacts take on an almost magnetic significance. In certain forgotten corners of early American estates, researchers have stumbled upon items whose origins are unmistakably European, but whose routes across the Atlantic remain a puzzle. A few carry inscriptions in archaic French, Latin, or Old Frankish dialects. Others bear symbols associated with chivalric orders long lost to time, or with ancient royalty whose bloodlines disappeared from official genealogies centuries ago. Among these items are occasional traces, faint but undeniable, of the enigmatic imagery linked to the Merovingians. One such relic, discovered in an estate once belonging to a prominent colonial family, was a small metal emblem shaped like a bee. Its craftsmanship suggested great age, its style reminiscent of the metalwork associated with early Frankish kings. No record explained how it arrived in America. The family who held it had no documented connection to France, yet the emblem had been passed from one generation to the next as an heirloom of unknown origin. Some dismissed it as a curio, a decorative trinket acquired during later travels. But others, noting the deep symbolic meaning of the bee within Merovingian lore, saw its presence as too peculiar to ignore. Artifacts like this do not exist in isolation. In the archives of an old church in Quebec, a weathered manuscript surfaced during a renovation in the early 20th century. Written in a mixture of French and Latin, it appeared to be a genealogical record copied from an older European document. The manuscript contained references to a lineage rooted in the ancient kings of the Franks, with notations about a family that allegedly migrated to the New World to preserve the old blood in new lands. The document was never authenticated. Its edges were too worn, its origins too nebulous. But its existence intrigues scholars who recognize parallels between its phrasing and medieval chronicles describing Merovingian descent. Even more mysterious are the stone carvings scattered across early American settlements. Some appear on old gravestones, bearing symbols atypical for the region or the era. Others appear on the foundations of colonial houses, carved into lintels or incorporated into hearthstones. Crosses with elongated arms, lily motifs interwoven with spirals, geometric patterns evocative of sacred European sigils. These carvings puzzle historians. They do not fit neatly into the symbolic language of early American settlers, yet they do not perfectly align with known French or English colonial designs either. Instead, they bear fragments of older artistic traditions, as if their creators were drawing from memories, legends, or inherited symbols whose original meanings had begun to fade. A frontier cabin in the Appalachian region contained a fireplace stone carved with a design resembling a stylized fleur-de-lis flanked by 3 circles. The cabin itself was unremarkable, a typical settlement structure. Yet the carvings seemed out of place, executed with a precision that suggested intention rather than decoration. When traced back through property records, the family who built the cabin had arrived from Scotland under unusually vague circumstances. Their oral history claimed descent from noble blood escaping turmoil, though no documents substantiated their claims. The carving remained unexplained, a silent marker hinting at forgotten lineage or symbolic devotion. In the archives of several early American Masonic lodges, researchers have uncovered sketches, lecture notes, and ritual diagrams referencing symbols not commonly associated with mainstream Freemasonry. Among them are depictions of long-haired kings sitting upon thrones surrounded by bees, inscriptions referencing the ancient guardians, and diagrams positioning the fleur-de-lis at the center of esoteric geometric patterns. These materials, often tucked between more mundane documents, appear to represent teachings or explorations embraced by only a select group within lodges. Whether these were symbolic meditations or references to actual belief in surviving royal bloodlines remains unclear. But their presence indicates that some early American fraternities engaged with ideas linked to the Merovingians, whether metaphorically or with literal intent. A lesser-known discovery involved a wooden chest found in a farmhouse in the Hudson Valley. Inside were parchment scraps containing what looked like parts of family tree, with tangled lines connecting names unfamiliar to the recorded history of the region. Several entries were identified with symbols instead of surnames: crowned lilies, triquetras, and the unmistakable outline of a bee. The chest also contained a small iron key and a ring engraved with a design resembling the interwoven initials of an early Frankish king. The family who owned the farmhouse had no knowledge of these items. They claimed the chest had been in the attic for generations. Scholars debated its authenticity, yet the items collectively suggested fragments of family origin that had never been publicly acknowledged. Some artifacts that hint at possible Merovingian echoes are far more subtle: scraps of letters, personal journals, or marginal notes in old books. A diary kept by an early traveler in Louisiana described meeting a wealthy landowner who claimed his lineage traced to the long-haired kings of old Europe. The traveler did not take the claim seriously, assuming it was an eccentric boast. Yet he noted the man possessed a gold pendant shaped like a stylized lily, worn beneath his clothing. Another account, written by a priest in the early 1700s, mentioned baptizing a child whose family provided a coat of arms bearing symbols of ancient French royalty not recognized by the heralds of Paris. Such remarks, scattered through centuries-old writings, may amount to nothing, or they may represent a pattern too faint for conventional history to trace. Perhaps the most puzzling artifacts are those found far from French or Scottish settlements, items buried in regions with little documented European influence during the colonial period. A stone tablet unearthed in a Midwestern field bore markings reminiscent of early European runes mixed with shapes associated with Frankish symbols. Its authenticity remains hotly debated. Another item, a piece of jewelry discovered along a riverbank, included a central motif that some scholars identified as a stylized Merovingian chrysanthemum. No recorded expedition or migration explains how such an object would have traveled so far inland. Each artifact alone is a curiosity, easily dismissed as coincidence, misinterpretation, or the natural blending of cultures. But when viewed collectively, scattered across homes, churches, lodges, and forgotten estates, they form a mosaic of quiet anomalies. These fragments of the past suggest that some settlers carried with them not just possessions, but a heritage steeped in dynastic symbolism, ancient beliefs, and perhaps even suppressed genealogies. Whether these relics are the fading echoes of travelers who once guarded their identity in secret, or whether they represent a more deliberate effort to seed the new world with remnants of Europe's oldest royal traditions, remains a matter of speculation. But their existence challenges the assumption that America emerged without the influence of hidden dynastic legacies. Instead, these artifacts imply that beneath the Republic's public story lies an undercurrent of forgotten ancestry, objects and symbols that hint at ties to a lineage history tried to bury, but which memory and material traces refuse to completely surrender. Across the evolving landscape of the young United States, a quiet pattern began to reveal itself, subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet unmistakable to those who trace the hidden architecture of influence. Certain families, certain institutions, and certain ideas seem to rise in synchrony, as though following a rhythm older than the Republic itself. It was not a conspiracy in the theatrical sense, with secret councils plotting beneath candlelight. Rather, it was a drift of inheritance, a merging of old-world legacies into the veins of a new nation. This drift carried with it the possibility, still debated, still shadowed, that Europe's oldest dynastic threads, including those of the enigmatic Merovingians, had quietly integrated themselves into the ideological and political atmosphere of the New World. As the 19th century progressed, America witnessed the emergence of a cultural and political elite whose origins were comfortably rooted in colonial lineage. These families often married within their own circles, forming webs of alliances reminiscent of European aristocracy. Their estates expanded. Their children attended the same universities. Their influence spread through trade companies, banks, courts, and legislative halls. And woven through the genealogy of some of these families were stories, never spoken loudly, never publicly proclaimed, suggesting connections to old bloodlines long shrouded in European mystery. In certain cases, the connections were subtle. A surname that suddenly appeared in an American context after centuries of silence in Europe, or a coat of arms preserved quietly within a household whose members rarely discussed its origins. In other cases, the associations were more pronounced. Some families kept meticulously detailed ancestral records, hinting that their reasons for doing so extended beyond mere tradition. Their journals described long-forgotten European estates, distant relatives who had served in royal courts, or ancestral legends about sacred lineages. None of these records mention the Merovingians by name, yet the symbols scattered throughout them, bees, lilies, intertwined crosses, invited speculation. During this period, America's intellectual climate grew, increasingly receptive to mysticism, ancient wisdom, and esoteric traditions. The fires of transcendentalism, the fascination with ancient civilizations, and the rebirth of occult societies created fertile ground for ideas that blurred the boundaries between history and myth. Lectures on sacred kingship, mystical bloodlines, and the spiritual inheritance of nations became fashionable among scholars and gentlemen's societies. In some cities, private salons gathered members of influential families to discuss the hidden forces shaping world history. Within these circles, the idea of ancient royal bloodlines surviving across continents did not provoke ridicule. It was a topic greeted with curiosity, sometimes reverence. And among the names whispered in these gatherings was the suggestion that the earliest kings of the Franks, those mysterious long-haired rulers whose power was believed by some to be divine, might have left descendants who migrated far beyond Europe's borders. None of this appeared in official American institutions, yet the influence of esoteric thought began to seep into architecture, literature, and symbolism. Public buildings adopted neoclassical designs rooted in ancient European and Mediterranean traditions. Universities embraced curricula that emphasized ancient history, sacred texts, and the continuity of civilizations. Fraternal organizations flourished, mixing Enlightenment ideals with older, more enigmatic philosophies. In certain Masonic and quasi-Masonic circles, rituals evolved to emphasize themes of lineage, guardianship, and the preservation of hidden knowledge. While mainstream historians interpret this as symbolic, others argue that these rituals may have served as a quiet means of acknowledging the presence, or belief, of ancient ancestry within the ranks. Some rituals referenced forgotten kings, the blood that guides, or the lineage that survives beyond the fall of empires. Whether these phrases referred to mythic archetypes or to actual genealogical beliefs remains ambiguous. Meanwhile, political rhetoric in the United States began to echo the language of destiny and providence. The notion of a chosen nation, guided by an unseen hand, resonated with a population increasingly enamored with mystical and historical grandeur. For some observers, this mirroring of ancient royal ideology seemed coincidental. For others, it hinted that America's foundational identity had absorbed echoes of Old World concepts that aligned curiously with the Merovingian legacy of sacred leadership. As new territories opened and the frontier pushed westward, certain families took on roles that felt almost archetypal. They became stewards of towns, founders of institutions, and patrons of cultural life. Their reputations carried a quiet authority, as though inherited rather than earned. Their presence created an impression of continuity, a sense that the old structures of power, though officially rejected by the Republic, had found new expression in a society claiming to have broken from them. It is within this subtle consolidation of influence that the question becomes unavoidable. Do these families simply embody the natural dynamics of a developing nation, or did they carry lineages whose roots stretched into the early medieval past? If some among them possessed ancestral connections to forgotten dynasties, would they have felt any duty to preserve the memory, or would such heritage, if real, have remained concealed to avoid ridicule or misunderstanding? The esoteric societies of the period offer another layer of intrigue. Their private lectures occasionally reference the idea of silent custodians or inheritors of ancient trust, phrases that, stripped of context, convey little but, when viewed in conjunction with other symbols, suggest a belief in living descendants of sacred lines. Some societies even taught that certain bloodlines acted as bridges between eras, preserving continuity during historic upheavals. These beliefs were rarely documented, often passed orally between initiates, leaving behind only fragments of interpretations. By the late 19th century, America's cultural elite had grown more sophisticated, better connected, and increasingly global in their outlook. Travel to Europe became common among wealthy families, and during these journeys, some encountered their distant cousins, nobles, scholars, or estates keepers who hinted knowingly at shared ancestry. Letters from this period occasionally reference old kinships or heritage older than nations, phrasing that leaves ample room for speculation. The industrial age and the rise of modernity did little to erase these undercurrents. If anything, the advent of genealogical societies, historical preservation movements, and renewed interest in medieval Europe gave such ideas new platforms. Researchers began to trace lineages with greater precision, uncovering odd gaps or surprising overlaps that hinted at migrations not recorded in mainstream chronicles. Scholars exploring medieval France occasionally noted the sudden disappearance of certain noble lines, disappearances that coincided suspiciously with the early waves of migration to North America. Whether these absences represent lost branches of Merovingian descent remains an open question. Yet the possibility lingers, persistent and quietly compelling, that America's rise was shaped not only by political visionaries and Enlightenment philosophers, but also by the faint, concealed inheritance of ancient bloodlines that crossed the ocean seeking anonymity, survival, or a new beginning. As the era strained toward the 20th century, the threads grew fainter, but they never fully disappeared. They lived on in stories whispered by elders, in symbols carved into forgotten corners of old estates, in genealogical manuscripts stored in attic chests, and in the lingering suspicion that some part of Europe's oldest mystery had taken root in the soil of the New World.